In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss image sharpening in Photoshop and Lightroom. There are three types of sharpening that you'll want to do to an image. First is capture sharpening, second is local contrast enhancement, and then third would be output sharpening. The difference between these is that when you first take a picture with a digital camera, the way the sensor works, the Bayer sensor divides each pixel is rendered by 4 pixels on the sensor for the 3 primary colors: 2 green pixels, 1 blue, and 1 red. And then the software takes the data from those pixels and puts them together to make the actual colored pixels that are used in the image that you see on the screen. And that process reduces image sharpness. And so by using the Unsharp mask filter at the very beginning, when you first import the picture, you're going to bring back some of that image detail that seems to be lost by the design of the Bayer sensor. If we do this in Lightroom and come down here to the detail box, right now I've got the sharpening turned to 0, and I'm going to magnify this up to 100%. And you can see that the fine detail in areas like the grass here, there really isn't very good fine detail resolution. Larger detailed areas like the tombstones and such, they look sharp enough, but they're not. But the grass really shows a loss of detail that ought to be there. Now, by using the sharpening, we can bring that back. And the sharpening that the detail controls here give you in Lightroom, this is capture sharpening. This is sharpening this is working with a raw file and sharpening the details in that raw file. If you're shooting JPEGs, you're not going to want to do this because the JPEGs have sharpening built in by the camera. The camera does the capture sharpening for you. If you're shooting RAW, though, you definitely want to do this in Lightroom or Photoshop. And the controls in Photoshop are basically the same as what you see in here. You're just going to use the Unsharp mask filter. Or if you use Photoshop's Camera Raw, you'll find the sharpening tools are built into that. And they all work the same way, so I'm going to demonstrate in Lightroom. Now, there's different controls here. There's the amount, there's radius, detail, and masking. The masking I usually leave at 0, and what this does is if you increase the masking number, it tells the software not to apply the sharpening to very fine details. And the purpose of that is, if you have a very noisy image, that would increase noise if you didn't use the masking. But my experience has been that if I leave the masking at 0 and then use the noise reduction built into Lightroom for high ISO images, that actually gives better image detail. So I leave the masking at 0. The default for radius is 1.0, and the default for detail is 25, and the default for sharpening is 25 also, if you first open an image in Lightroom. The radius actually works best if you reduce it lower than 1. If you have an image like this that has very fine detail, like these individual blades of grass, you're going to want to reduce the radius down to about 0.5. And then the sharpening amount you're going to want to raise. You can see as we raise it, it's bringing the detail, but if we go too high, the image starts to really fall apart. It starts to look really unnatural. Let's bring this back down to the default of 25. The detail slider actually increases detail a bit better without starting to give that unnatural, nasty look to it. But if you raise this too high, it's going to start increasing noise a bit. A good setting for many images is around 50 for detail, and then we'll start increasing the amount a little bit. Now our goal here is we want to restore some of the detail in here, but we don't want to go so high that it starts looking unnatural. And I think I'm going to look around the image here and see how it's affected different parts of the image aside from just the grass. It's starting to look a little unnatural around these hard lines here, around the swings and around the swing set poles. I think we need to have these settings pulled down a bit. For the capture sharpening, we don't want to make this as sharp as it can possibly be. We'll deal with that when we do the output sharpening. We're just trying to make this right now so that we're getting back the detail that was lost by the sensor. And I think this is a good setting for that. You don't want it to be too over sharpened because it'll look unnatural, but when you're doing capture sharpening, it's better to err on the side of not quite sharpening enough than it is to over sharpen. Now this image was shot at ISO 100 on my Canon 5D Mark II, so it really doesn't have much noise. It looks like there might be a little back here in the fog, although that may just be the effect of the fog itself. I'm going to leave that alone as it is. If I were working with a high ISO image, you could increase the noise reduction and get rid of that, and it really isn't affecting this. Yeah, we're getting rid of the noise a bit there with this, but by having it up too high, I've got it at 20 right now, you can see we're really losing the detail in the grass that ought to be there, and I don't think it's worth losing that in this image just to get rid of that teeny bit of noise in the fog. I think it's better to leave the noise reduction down to 0. Now if I'm working with an image that was shot at 1600 or 3200, if I increase the noise reduction up to about 20 or 25 and then raise the sharpening up a bit higher to compensate, that actually gets rid of the noise very well without losing detail. But for low ISO images like this, I think we're better off staying with the noise reduction turned off. And since we have this looking the way I like it, I think it's time to open it up in Photoshop, and then we can... Actually, you know what? Let's not do that. Let me show you how to do local contrast enhancement. You can do local contrast enhancement in Photoshop using the Unsharp mask filter. Lightroom doesn't have the Unsharp mask controls for local contrast enhancement. Instead, it has a tool that they call Clarity, and it's here under Presence, near the top of the controls. If you increase the clarity, you can see how it increases contrast within the image, which is the same thing that local contrast enhancement does using Unsharp masking, except that it's a much simpler process. There's only one single slider. You push it up or down. And I've gone way too high on this. I don't think I would want this image looking that contrasty. This is a foggy day, very soft image. But if you look here, we have the clarity control, and then we also have a contrast control. And the difference between those is how it affects the overall image contrast. If you look at the histogram up here, you can see this area here represents the highlights, this over here represents the blacks and the shadow tones. If you increase contrast using the contrast slider, you can see that the histogram is expanding. The highlights are moving toward the edge, the shadows are moving toward the edge. This means that if you increase the contrast too much, you can actually lose detail in the whites. They can go up to where they're higher than 100% brightness, where they go to pure white, no detail at all. And the same can happen to the blacks. If you go too far with that, they can go down to where they're pure black, no detail, just solid black. You usually don't want that to happen, so if we turn the contrast back to 0 again, to the default, and use clarity, and we increase it, we can see that it's actually not really affecting the histogram all that much. The highlights are staying where they're at, the shadows are staying where they're at. The contrast increase is happening in the midtones, but it's not affecting the highlights and shadows. And so this lets you get higher midtone contrast without losing detail in the lights and darks. And I'm going to set the clarity back to 0 on this one because I want to open this one in Photoshop and show you how to do the exact same thing using the Unsharp mask filter in Photoshop. And in Lightroom we can go up here to Photo, Edit in, Photoshop CS5. Choose Edit a Copy with the Lightroom adjustments. Choose Render using Lightroom. It'll take it a second or so to open this up. And here we have our file. Now, if we look at this file at actual pixels, which is the same as looking at it at 100% in Lightroom, we can see our sharpening that we've done, how it's brought the detail into the grass and everything. We've got good detail up here in the swing set bar. We can see all the raindrops hanging on the bottom of it and all the detail in the chains. So this is what our capture sharpening has given us. We haven't done any of the local contrast enhancement because I turned that back to 0 in Lightroom. So to do that in Photoshop, we're going to go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Now, if we were using Unsharp Mask in Photoshop to do the initial capture sharpening that we had just done in Lightroom, we would do it the same way. We'd choose a low radius, about half a pixel, and then adjust the amount to what we want. What we're trying to do here, though, is we're trying to get that contrast increase in the midtones. The way to do that is actually to use a large radius. Now, the amount that you're going to use is going to depend on the size of your image. The 21 megapixel image that this camera gives, a radius of about 30 or even 35 is pretty good to start with. And then you adjust the amount to adjust the amount of contrast increase. If we go down to 1%, we see it's very little. If we start increasing it to 10%, 20%, now you can see the contrast has increased. We click off the preview here, we can see very dramatically the difference this has made. Let's go ahead and hit OK on this. Look at it the full image. And in our history palette, we'll turn this on and off so you can see the effect on the entire image. Now notice that this has only affected basically the midtones. It hasn't increased the white sky. It hasn't darkened the blacks. So we haven't lost detail in the lights or darks. We've just given a little bit more contrast to the midtones. This is an image actually I don't think really needs a whole lot of this because, as I said, it was shot on a very foggy, rainy day. You want the soft light to come through on this one. But on many other images, this local contrast enhancement can be very useful. You know what? I think I'll keep a little bit of this because I didn't do this too heavy-handedly. I think we'll stay with this. It gives a little bit more variation in the grass. Now the third type of sharpening we need to do is called output sharpening. Now the output sharpening we don't do on the full size file. Everything we've done so far has been on the full resolution file. Now after I do the capture sharpening and then doing the local contrast enhancement, whether I do it in Photoshop or Lightroom, I then save the file and use that as an archive file. I keep that as a file that I can go back to make prints from and such in the future, but I always keep that as a full resolution file. You never want to take your file and reduce it in size to make a small print and keep that as the only version you have, because in the future, if you decide to make a large print, if you have only that small file, you're stuck with it. You're going to have to go back to the raw file and redo all your work. And so I do all my editing on the full size file. I do the adjusting the white balance and the contrast and the sharpening and all that. Any dodging and burning that I have to do using layer masks, all that is done on the full resolution file, and then that's saved as an archive. Now let's say I want to make a print from this. I will open up the archive file, which I already have on the screen, so we won't do that now. And I will duplicate it because I never want to do any resizing or anything like that on the archive file. I want to save that as a full resolution file. So we'll duplicate it like we've done here and then close the original archive file. And actually, I'm not going to save that now. I can go back to Lightroom and work on it later. Normally, you would, after you've done the work on it, of course, you would want to save it. This is one I've cropped to a long panoramic, so it's going to be an unusual print size. But let's say that I want to make a, let's see what we can get out of it here. Let's make it 14 inches wide. That way I can print it on a 13 by 19 sheet of paper. Give a little bit of room for borders around it for matting and framing and signing and everything. So this is going to give us a 6.5 by 14 inch print at 300 dpi. And the printer I use actually works better at 360 dpi, so we'll change the resolution to that. And we'll hit OK to resize it. Now let's look at it at actual pixels. This is 100% view. Now this actually looks very sharp the way it is because I haven't really reduced it much in size. If you take a large file and you reduce it to make a much smaller print, like let's say we had done like a 4x6 with it, the image is going to lose a lot of sharpness. I'm going to go ahead and resize this down to something even smaller so we can have a better example for our output sharpening. This is going to be a 2.7 by 6, so it'd be something that fit on a 4x6 sheet of paper. Okay, now the fine details in this actually look pretty good, but if we sharpen this a little bit more, we can bring out a little bit more texture in this grass and a little bit more detail in the stuff that's on the the parts of the swing set and everything here. And that's what output sharpening is. When you reduce an image file to a smaller pixel size like this, some of the detail that you have gets softened. Now some detail is lost altogether just because of the loss of resolution, but it also softens the apparent sharpness of that detail that remains. And so in order to compensate for that, we're going to go on and sharpen it again to bring that detail back before we print it. And we'll use Unsharp mask for that again. Under Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp mask. Now here we're going to be doing this totally differently as far as the settings from what we did for local contrast enhancement. For output sharpening, it's going to be done a lot more like how we did the capture sharpening. We're going to use a small radius, something smaller than 1 usually. The actual amount you can change depending on the image, but most of the time I recommend about 0.5. You almost never want to use a radius bigger than 1 because it starts to make the image look too harsh when you do that. So we're going to set our radius at 0.5, and then we're going to adjust our amount and see what we get. Now you can see as I raise this, the image is looking sharper, but it's starting to look a little bit kind of unnatural, almost digital in here because the details are being sharpened to the point that they almost look like big pixels. So we want to not use that big of an amount. Now if we put the amount to 0, you can see it really looks a lot softer. So we're going to start raising this up a bit. And for print, you want it to look just maybe slightly over sharpened, because in the small size print, it's not going to look the same as it does on the screen. And so if it looks a little bit, just a teeny bit over sharpened on the screen, it's going to look perfect in that little 4x6 print. And you know what? I think this is just about perfect for it. You can see that the grass is a lot more textured looking. You get a feel that the grass is not just a flat. It's not just a flat, a flat area. It has texture to it. It has shape to it. There's stuff in there. You feel like if you walk across this grass, you can feel the blades of grass on your feet. It's not like walking across a concrete floor. There's detail here, so we want to be able to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it like this. Hit OK, and that's our output sharpening. This would be ready to print if I were going to make a print this size with it. Now, when I make these files that I'm going to print like this, I save them under a different name than my archive file. I keep a separate folder I keep my resized ones in. And typically what I'll do is I'll save it under the file name, and then I'll attach to the file name the size that it's being printed. Like this one here, the file name is MG1689. That edit copy thing is something that Lightroom attached to it. What I would do is I would change it to MG1689-4x6. Because that's the size it's going to be, and I would save it like that as a. Usually, I would save it as a TIFF file if I'm going to print it myself. If I'm going to take it to a photo lab, most of them want JPEG, so I would save it as a JPEG in that case. And that way, I'll have. If I ever decide I need more prints of this size, I can go back to this file I've already prepared and not have to redo it again. So at this point, once I save it and make my print, we're done with it, and I can just keep this, for the future if I need to make another print of it. And so we've shown here the 3 types of sharpening. In almost every file, you're going to want to do all 3 kinds of sharpening. You need to do the capture sharpening when you first bring the picture into the computer. Of course, that's for raw images. If you're shooting JPEGs in the camera is going to do its own sharpening, unless you've got that turned off. If you're shooting raw, you do the capture sharpening to bring back those details lost by the sensor. Then you do your editing. Set your white balance, set your contrast, set your do all the different things that you would do in Lightroom or in Photoshop to make the picture look the way you want it as far as its color and contrast and all that. Then you would do the local contrast enhancement, which is the Unsharp masking using the really big radius and the smaller amount in order to increase contrast in the midtones without changing image sharpness. And if you're in Lightroom, that's called clarity is the name of the control there. But if you're doing it in Photoshop, you use Unsharp mask. And then the third type of sharpening you only do when you're ready to make a print. That's something you don't have to do with it when you're first editing the picture. It's something you do later when you're ready to make a print. And that just makes sure that the image details come out once you resize the image down to a small size for printing. Because when you resize the full resolution image down, you lose some of that image detail. I also do output sharpening for pictures I put on my website. If you've sized a picture down to put on the web, for example, on my site, almost all of my pictures are 640 pixels wide or 640 pixels high, whichever is the longer dimension. And if you're taking a 21 megapixel image and you're resizing that way down to something that's only 640 pixels on its long edge, that actually needs pretty substantial output sharpening in order to bring back that image detail, or else it's going to look very soft when people see it on your website. And so output sharpening is not just for printing; it's also for pictures that are going to go on the web. As I said, that's something you only do once you're ready to print the picture or when you're ready to make one to put online. And you should always keep an archive file that's full resolution, that's had the capture sharpening and the local contrast enhancement done to it, and save that as a TIFF or a PSD Photoshop file. Keep it as an archive, and don't do anything else. Don't resize it. Don't save it under a different size or anything. Always make a duplicate before you resize for output. That way, in the future, if somebody says, I love that picture in 5x7, can you make me an 11x14? You can say, absolutely. Go to your archive file, open it up, make a copy, size to 11x14, make the print. So I hope this has helped demystify some of the image sharpening controls in Photoshop and Lightroom. A lot of this isn't very intuitive. These controls, these amounts and radiuses and thresholds and such, they're not very intuitive controls, and even the name of the things, Unsharp mask, sounds like something that should be reducing sharpness, where in fact it will either increase sharpness in the case of capture sharpening or output sharpening, or in the case of local contrast enhancement, it doesn't affect sharpness, but it affects contrast. So Unsharp masking is it's not a very good description of what the thing does. And that name actually comes from the old days of film. And the way that this was done in film was you would take a negative or a transparency, and you would contact print it onto another sheet of film, but you would separate it from the film you're contact printing it on by a millimeter or two in order to make the contact printed version a little bit soft, a little bit unsharp. And then when you made the prints, you would sandwich the two of them together. And the effect of the Unsharp mask version sandwiched with it would reduce overall image contrast. And so when you increase contrast to compensate for it, as you would do in black and white photography by using different printing paper grades, it would increase the overall contrast back to normal, but the image details in the midtones would actually pop out as being a lot more detailed, a lot sharper. And I don't fully understand why exactly that worked, but that's what happened with it. And so that name Unsharp masking has carried on into the digital age with these tools in Photoshop, because they do the same thing. They just don't use an actual contact printed Unsharp negative made from the original to do it. And so if you're someone who started out with digital photography, you're not going to understand what the meaning of that is unless you know the history of photography or have worked with the older materials the way I have.